All right, folks. It's another episode of GAIN, the Generative AI News Rundown. I'm Brett Kinsella, founder of SymphonyAI, founder of VoiceBot.ai, and your host for the Generative AI News Rundown. And I have my co-host with me today, Eric Schwartz. Hey, Eric, how are you today?
Doing very well. Excited to talk all things AI.
Okay, what do we have? We've got OpenAI Hegemony on the precipice. We've got a lot of news from Microsoft, which is sort of interesting. I've just sent out the newsletter update, the post about this, pretty long, but it gave me some time to reflect on what we saw yesterday, which was a lot. There's also plenty of other news. Like you and I haven't even talked about this yet. Unity, all these other types of things that have been going on. But I'm going to cover you up for just one moment. And I also just want to let people know that yesterday we did this amazing GPT showcase. We called it Deep Dive Demos and Data. I think we looked at 8 or 10 different GPTs that had been created. And I would have to say, Eric, I was... and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but I was less enthusiastic about these before. I built several, before I talked to a bunch of people who were building several, and before I heard Microsoft talk about them as well. Even though they didn't say much, it was very interesting the way that they're thinking about it. So that GPT's on parade. If you are not familiar with GPTs, the sort of the latest phenomenon out of OpenAI, just go to our YouTube channel. So Andrew, our producer, can maybe put that in the chat for you. And it's YouTube /@ VoiceBot.ai. Definitely check that out because I think you're going to find it really interesting just to see what other people have built. They give you tips like what works and what doesn't, but also we had an amazing 40-minute developer panel at the end. So it's like a 2-hour session. It's almost like a mini conference we put together in 48 hours. So I hope people really like that. And by the way, anybody who's out there, hey, please let us know you're out there. Just say who you are, where you're in from. Feel free to comment, ask questions, whatever makes sense. Love to have you do that. We always integrate that into the show. It's one of the fun things that we do today. Okay, so what I want to start with, Eric, as we get to the news, let's start with Microsoft because that's new stuff. Although, as I reflected more on Ignite, it was packaged as new stuff, but actually most of it was already announced one place or another. They just sort of repackaged it. There were a few new announcements, but my headline was Microsoft Copilots everywhere, a BingChat facelift and shift to practical applications. But I would say that the really interesting thing that came out of this is Satya Nadella saying, our vision is pretty straightforward. We are a Copilot company. Full stop.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you about, what was the biggest news at Ignite? The specific date of when these things are launching.
Yes, which many of them are soon. Like some of them are this week in preview. Some of them are next month. Yep. Most of them are either available or imminent. And actually, Copilot 365 has been available for a couple of weeks now.
Yeah, but I mean, I think because it's when we talk about practicalities, we're talking about how it's not just that the technology itself is more practical. It's that as they actually start to come out, you can see what people are doing with them. What's their point? What are they able to do? What are they not able to do? It's a practicality on as these go from abstract, change, how you do business, to concrete. Here's the specific task that you do right now. It takes this long, and now it will take this long. I think that's very key. And I think, it's funny, last week we talked about how the OpenAI Dev Day sort of blotted out the sun for almost any other news all week. And I can only imagine Satya Nadella and Sam Altman laughing about how, they think this is a big deal until next week when we, essentially say, hey, how businesses have been run since Microsoft Windows came out? Now that's going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's it might not be getting enough play. And, I'll talk to people about this. It's just in terms of, in fact, I'll start with the end in mind because we'll go down at the bottom. And I talked about this in the post that I just put up. It's a Copilot company now. It's really an interesting positioning. And I want to get to all the news around this, but it's an interesting positioning people should pay attention to. They didn't say an AI company. They didn't say they're a generative AI company. People have already said that. And both of those would be equally rational based on what they're talking about, is calling themselves a Copilot company. But by calling themselves a Copilot company, they're basically not competing with Anthropic and Google and OpenAI. They're saying we live at the application layer. We live at the helpful layer. We actually create the applied generative AI solutions that make everything better.
Well, it's like when in the late 80s, early 90s, when they said we're a software company. We partner with the hardware companies. We don't, obviously they're heavily involved in all these elements, and just as they're obviously, OpenAI is increasingly, at least in some ways, a subsidiary. But Microsoft is saying, hey, you're a regular user of all things, standard technology. We're going to put the things into those technology that make them easier to use, better to use, more useful in some way. We're not saying that we're going to give you a computer, but we're saying we're going to give you what makes the computer useful and worth having.
Exactly. Really well said. Really well said. Okay. So let's talk about some of the announcements, because there were plenty of them. The top level announcement, which I thought was pretty interesting, was that BingChat, so the helpful disruptor of traditional search, bringing it into generative AI search, the answer engine, not the search engine in terms of searching, providing links, is now its own thing. It's called Copilot. You just go to copilot.microsoft.com and there you are. You've got the BingChat. And people will recognize a lot of the affordances here. There's a bunch of things like trying to tell you what it can do. You also have the ability to select the different, basically, temperature. Is it precise? Is it creative? That type of thing. I think it's a really interesting decision. When they first started it, they were coupling it with search. They were using the people knew Bing, and they got people to try Bing that hadn't tried it in years. But I think that this is really fascinating. Once you make it its own page, its own application, you're not tied to the legacy of search. And I have a feeling some of this was based on the idea that they weren't really disrupting search. Maybe they were getting more action on Bing than they had in the past. They got more people to try the Edge browser, but they weren't really disrupting search. And it's like, you don't break the habit by allowing people just to continue the habit, even though you have some fancy widget over on the side. And I think that it's mature enough now that it stands alone. And therefore, what they're doing is they're looking at things like ChatGPT, which people like, things like Perplexity, which is much smaller in terms of its user base, but is much more like ChatGPT. And they're saying, hey, we're just going to make this a standalone application, and gives them the added benefit of when you're using it from a consumer standpoint or a business standpoint, it can be a common interface, like Copilot for everything. So I think it's a really strong move on their part.
Yeah, and this, I'll just say this briefly, because it could be a whole other thing. There is a tendency in the sort of Silicon Valley culture to think that things like branding and marketing are secondary or don't really matter in terms of success, certainly even on a business side. But I think that's definitely not true, and I think that Microsoft maybe understands that Bing as a brand was a joke when it came out, and it feels like a joke now. But Microsoft Copilot, feels a lot stronger and a lot more durable and a lot more likely to attract people who, they hear Bing, they're like, what is Bing? They hear Copilot, they think, oh, it's something to help me complete a task. It seems like a very obvious move on their part.
That is a fascinating point. Like, Bing is fairly well known. It's like a big brand. It's been around a long time. Obviously, Microsoft spent millions, hundreds of millions, I'm sure, promoting it over the decade and a half that it's been around. But it could be, because of the moment we're in, that Copilot becomes a better brand name. And in fact, it's shedding the baggage of Bing. And it's like, this is something new and different. It's not just search anymore. It's actually something better. And by the way, a number of the features that they actually tell you to use in Bing are basically ChatGPT features. Write a blog post, help me write some code, these types of things. So by decoupling it, it's sort of interesting. They're more directly competing with ChatGPT, but at the same time, they're reframing the way people should think about these productivity tools that happen to have search as part of it.
Yeah, and I think that, it's easy, especially for people like us who are so immersed in it, to think that everyone is as either not even necessarily tech savvy, but tech aware as we are. And that's really not the case. And even though the pipeline between the average consumer and new technology is a lot shorter than it used to be, it still exists. And having something like the term Copilot that can augment, as well as, be a new feature, but also augment things that you're already using, that means that, people who are like ChatGPT, that sounds weird and technical and confusing, but they're like, oh, I'm on my standard Microsoft system and it says, oh, you can also use this. Great, I'll just try that. I don't have to deal with anything else.
They've also co-opted like a useful term. I mean, I think they were the ones who came out with the GitHub Copilot and Copilot everything, and they just make it harder for everybody else to use the term. And so I think like anytime if people just think, oh, Copilot's the thing that helps me. I've got ChatGPT. I know what that is. Copilots are things that help me. I know what that is. Anyone else who tries to use that term, it's going to be really hard for them to get rid.
I genuinely believe that in terms of good decisions by Microsoft in the last several years, number one was opening the checkbook for OpenAI, but number two was saying Copilot. What a great metaphor! What a great product name we can use for everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into some of the actual news just to package this up for everybody. Got like 2 points here in addition to products. So Microsoft Copilot for 365, that's already out. They actually named a number of customers. There's a couple of like minor improvements on that, but mostly that's been around for a couple of weeks. Microsoft Copilot Studio. This is actually kind of more important and newer. So essentially it's a way for you within Microsoft 365 to create your own customized version of this. So they already have the idea that it'll ground the responses based on your Microsoft Graph data. And they actually had some interesting things with SharePoint. I've resisted using SharePoint most of my career, but essentially it might be useful, particularly if you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, to use SharePoint, because that's a place where you can just put everything, and then Copilots or the Copilots you create as well will be able to tap into that and really go beyond sort of the basic search and summarization and creation features that most people do today. One other notable thing is that they're going to support GPTs, and GPTs coming from OpenAI, this new no-code bot builder concept. I think that most of the GPTs are going to be trash. In fact, I've tried many of them, and most of them are just like not that interesting. And I can't imagine using them again other than just trying them. But I have little doubt that there will be some very effective GPTs, whether just no code or with the assistant API builder or something else, that wind up in the GPTs marketplace. And the opportunity to actually bring those in is actually really useful. The other thing is OpenAI is shifting from plugins to GPTs. It's really trying to put all of its plugin companies there, which really means, from a practical standpoint, all the application and information service providers are going to have GPTs or some version of that likely, and that'll be something that Microsoft can tap into. So I think that actually gives more legs to this, because a lot of the companies who are building, or a lot of the people who are thinking about building GPTs will say, oh, I can put it on the OpenAI marketplace. Maybe that's useful for me for ChatGPT users. But also, if I want to be part of the Microsoft ecosystem, this is probably the most robust way to do that.
Yeah, and it's telling. I mean, people are saying like, oh, these are like the apps for an iPhone, having a GPT, and as you say, a lot of them are going to be trash. Well, I mean, that's honestly not so much the Apple Store, since they tend to be pretty strict, but certainly Google Play is littered with terrible and nonsense apps, and that may be the case here. But as we mentioned when they launched GPTs, having played around with a similar concept in Poe, I think that there's going to be a lot of really very useful narrow purpose apps out there, and I think that Microsoft will give a hub for those that are on the maybe more of the enterprise business focused ones, but the ones that are still really useful within that context.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we've got Microsoft Copilot for Service. The important thing here is not Microsoft Copilot for Service, although that's probably useful, is that this is one of the first, and there's another one in just a moment, but one of the first domain-specific copilots that they're enabling. They're basically creating templates. This is precisely what OpenAI with ChatGPT Enterprise presented first week in September at a conference I was at, Voice and AI. Shout out to Pete Erickson about that. They said they're basically going to create templates by professional functional domains. And so this is one of the first ones. There's another one in here for managing your Azure, all of your Azure IT requirements and those types of things. But I think that's super interesting. That'll like help people create their own Copilot through templates based on functional areas. They're going to wind up customizing it, but it's probably just a way for them to get into it faster. The Microsoft Dynamics 365 guide was, I guess, the sex appeal of the event, because basically they showed HoloLens, which is a less cumbersome version than the Apple Vision Pro. And they showed like these Tony Stark type things for people in the manufacturing environment. I'd say the thing I really took away from this, not just that Microsoft actually looks like they're doing a practical application and Apple is not, and that like Apple, like it's designed for the couch, where this is designed for like the world, was that when we think of generative AI and the generative AI revolution, and I do this myself, I think of it as mostly a white collar functional revolution. It's like the things that knowledge workers have done largely are going to be revolutionized. And this, I don't know if it'll take off or not, how popular it'll be, but what Microsoft is saying, no, this is for not just for the white collar work in the cubicle at your desk. This is for people who are out in the world, who are making things, who are running manufacturing plants, who are doing repair and service.
Yeah, it is that. It's funny. The two things I thought of when they were doing this is, one, they don't mention it, but Microsoft had a very big contract with the Department of Defense for something like this for soldiers to be built into their helmets. So I wonder if this is a derivative of some of that development.
Future soldier heads-up display.
Yeah,
yeah, a number of places did. I don't know. Like it might have come from that, but like this seems super practical, and I think like if you're DuPont, for example, and you're a big chemical manufacturer, you mostly have factories. You also have a lot of white collar workers. Maybe you're using a Copilot for your white collar office work, and then everybody has email, so everyone can use it for that. But can I use it in the plant? And there's a lot of other solutions out there that have like sort of moved down this path. I think it'll be really interesting to see if this gets adopted. Okay, so let's talk about some other things. The other big area where what I'm calling generative AI foundations, but it's more technical things. So a couple other announcements. Model as a service. This was announced to build in general, but the fact that Llama 2 and Mistral, one of the European large language, or actually very new large language model providers, although it's like kind of small, like 7B is like their first one. But they're both going to be available a la carte. So this is, I think, significant because I know a lot of people have tried to set up Llama 2 environments and they realize it's more complex than they expected, and it's much more expensive. I mean, on the order of 10K, just like for 10K a month, just to get it up and running and have it available. That's before you really do anything with it. It can be much more than that. Azure AI Studio, that appears to me to be simpler to OpenAI's Assistant API. I have to look at it a little bit more.
Yeah.
You agree?
Yeah, I think I do think it's similar. I think it's has a little more integration with some of Microsoft's other features, mainly,
yes.
But
more robust. Similar but more robust. So you got the Assistance API is really just like you got the playground, you got a couple of functions, like, and then you have to do everything else yourself. Whereas Microsoft has some tooling, frameworks, other services you can just tap into immediately. Okay, great. So vector search. So if it's all Copilots these days, if it weren't all Copilots these days, it might be all RAGs. Retrieval augmented generation, everyone wants to talk about, because knowledge management is basically the number one use case right now for generative AI. They're basically saying, we have all this data. How do we get useful, particularly natural language data? How do we get useful out of it? How do we get use out of that? And vector databases are that. And so they have some new vector search solutions. They're also offering GPT-4 Turbo, Vision, DALL-E. Those are the new OpenAI announcements from last week. Those are available in preview. And the NVIDIA AI Foundry service, which they made a big deal out of. They gave Jensen stage time, which I think is more just like the more Jensen's happy with me, maybe the better my business goes right now. But I think it's interesting because, the Nemo, and I think I heard him say Nemotron, which is so funny because we had someone from the Nemo team on Synthesia 4 a couple weeks ago. In fact, that video will probably be out first of next week, talking through all the things they're doing. I talked to him about this. I'm like, Megatron, Nemo. You have to like Nemo's at a model. What is it? And I think we have to clarify this, but I think they just renamed all of their language models Nemotrons, which comes from the Megatron background and things like that. But maybe not. We'll see. I just heard that as an aside. But in any event, like if you want access to the NVIDIA large language models, the Omniverse tools, those types of things, they're all going to be there. This sounds a lot like what they announced with Google Cloud in August, but maybe more comprehensive, or maybe it's just more mature at this point. But I think that's all. Is that all I had to say? I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to bring up from your story.
I would just briefly point that, as we've talked about before, and the generative AI competition is the cloud competition, and the cloud competition needs those chips. So anything that makes NVIDIA happy with your company is a good idea.
All right, great. All right, so hey, Jürgen Gravestein, good to see you here. See, tangential. Oh, yeah, and actually, just another thing here. Tangential remark. I thought Rain had a big contract with Black & Decker for blue collar voice stuff. Yes, that's true. Actually,
yeah,
they did, and they actually showed some of that working in a demo like a year ago. We had them on the VoiceBot podcast. Actually, it was a year and a half ago. We haven't heard that much from it since then, but the whole idea was like voice enablement. I think what we're talking about here with like HoloLens and the guides and things like that, it's a level above that, because it's not just voice interaction for people who are like what they call deskless workers.
Yeah, and I think we've also, there have been other industrial voice assistant and things for not just factories, but especially for people going out and performing tasks. And a lot of them were built around, answering the simple questions and then streamlining, filling in forms and linking back to home offices. And this is exactly the kind of thing that will make that even more efficient.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so hey, everybody out there, let us know you're here. Feel free to make comments, but also please give us a like on LinkedIn or YouTube. Definitely appreciate that. Actually, one other, or maybe just two other quick things I'll just tell people about, just resources that we have. We had a pretty amazing discussion with Brad Abrams, who runs BingChat, and he runs Copilot for Windows. Which means he runs all the Copilot stuff right now. And this was a couple of weeks ago, so he didn't talk about the rebranding of it, but he did sort of hint that things are going to change. The reason I'm pointing people to this, we have this video. You can you can get it on Synthedia, or you can just go to YouTube and watch it right now. He talks in depth about how this works, about how they wrangled GPT-4 to make it work, lessons learned, the larger context window when you use precise. There's a lot of knowledge bombs in there, really useful nuggets. I think it's worthwhile for people to check out if this is something that interests you. And then also, this has been super popular. Mona Wallen, who is the product manager for Azure OpenAI service, was also there. We published that earlier this week, or maybe over the weekend, her video there. She goes into a lot of depth. There's a little bit of upfront, like, we're Azure, this is what we do. But she actually talks through all the use cases that people are deploying. She just has like one slide, which is basically bangs on all these. And then the next slide is like, oh, and here's what they're doing by industry, right? And so I think just those two things alone were very interesting. But she talked about orchestration. She talked about which use cases are most popular, which are the second most popular, personalization. So I think people will really get a lot out of that. All right, so let's move on to OpenAI. And we've got a couple things to talk about there. So first, I wrote this story over the weekend about OpenAI's bid to become a data titan. And I think this is like an underreported discussion. We think of large language model providers, creators, as being consumers of data of the world. And what we've learned more recently is a couple things. One is the curation of that data, like the quality of that data makes a big difference in how well these things perform. But then the amount. They need a lot more. And so we've seen that. We saw those trend lines at Synthedia 4 about how it used to be all about parameters, but we're seeing a divergence around data. In fact, the divergence is data is growing much faster than parameter count. And in fact, in many cases, more data, fewer parameters, better model, right? And so then the question is, how do companies get that data? And today they can scrape the web, which is costly. They can access some open source repositories, which, can also be costly to wrangle those and make those work, but they can also buy it, or they can use their own. And it should not be surprising to people that Facebook, Meta, which has a lot of data, has an amazing large language model. Now, it just happens to be open source, Llama 2. And Google, which has a lot of data, has a pretty amazing large language model in PaLM. And I think on December 13th, they're going to announce Gemini. I don't know that that's been formally announced yet, but I think that's out there. Okay, so but like OpenAI, they can become just a consumer of data, or they creator of data. And this is one of the things that people don't understand about ChatGPT, or maybe don't talk about enough, is that when you have 100 million weekly active users, when you have hundreds of millions of people that use this, and many more people who are using it now because of GPTs, you have the opportunity to actually have a lot more user-generated content, which you can then use to train your models in just a couple ways. So obviously, there's 4 different types of content that they have access to. Public content, and from a public content standpoint, GPT bot was announced earlier this year. They are now doing their own web scraping. They're not just using other people's piles of data. So they're pulling that data, and that allows them to curate a little bit more places that they spend time and places they don't. They can reduce the amount of garbage data in their data set. Partner content. They've made announcements recently with the AP. They had another big announcement. I'm trying to think. Shutterstock was the other big one. So data, and there's going to be more of those coming up. So this idea is it's like high quality data that they're bringing in. This also gives them sort of the benefit of potentially having some agreement in place so they don't get accused of copyright infringement. But partner content. And then they have this created content. That's number 4 on this list. And the created content is, a lot of it is really just the RLHF stuff, the humans that are actually looking at the outputs, and they're providing more information to the large language model so that the answers are better, right? But increasingly, there's synthetic content that they're generating. More importantly, and that's the whole point here that I want to get people their head around, is this user-generated content. So ChatGPT is a great source of that for them, but GPTs is a better source of that content, because people are actually uploading their own content, their own data, which they say is grounded data, that they're vouching for its veracity, and they're putting it into ChatGPT, which then is available for training models. So when we look at this, are you always going to be behind Google and Facebook because they have all the data, or Meta, or are you going to be a consumer? You're going to have to pay for this, or you're going to have your own pile of data? And I think OpenAI is actually got a great strategy on this front, and they have, maybe by luck with ChatGPT, they've got a lot more access to this than they would have, and they become competitive. But it is yet another instance where it puts them or gives them an advantage over Anthropic, Cohere, AI21, some of these other organizations that are almost exclusively relying on other people's data. So that was my expository on OpenAI. And you can add to that if you want, but we'll also just say, just like on those, along those lines, just like it's related. We had the GPT showcase yesterday. Check that out on YouTube. It was really insightful. But if anyone wondered whether these are popular or not, OpenAI, and this is where it comes from, the OpenAI's hegemony on the rise, they shut down subscriptions for ChatGPT Plus. In fact, Andrew, if you don't mind, check to see if it's still shut down. There's a wait list now. So the company, who everyone said would never make any money and was just a sinkhole for cash, had to stop taking cash because there were too many people who wanted their $20 service, which, I estimate just like right now is like well over a $500 million business on an annual run rate standpoint. I'm guessing the fact that they shut it down, it's probably closer to $1 billion just now. And when they open it up again, it will be even bigger. And that might be the ATM that basically funds all these other activities. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got in just under the wire, because I got it a couple days ago, because I realized like, at this point, $20 is ridiculously cheap. So I mean, I do wonder, if the naysayers will say, oh yeah, they're bringing in cash, but it's not nearly enough. But I don't know. I think it's pretty clear that they could charge, they can make more tiers and charge more for some extra bonuses and have no problem attracting new customers.
I actually hadn't really thought about that. I think a lot of people would sign up for one, because the performance as a ChatGPT Plus subscriber, the performance has been garbage since they or the availability, I should say. But also the performance, because I was trying to use code interpreter and it just wasn't as good because so many people are creating GPTs. There's all these people who are weekly active users just became daily active users over the last week, and it's too much load on the system. Jürgen said Anthropic's Claude allows for document uploads. I assume they also collect and use that data for future training. I don't know if they do or not, and that is true. And my daughter told me that that everyone in college uses ChatGPT, but everyone in grad school uses Anthropic's Claude because of the bigger context window, because of the way it sort of handles natural language data.
Surprised.
But it's just not anywhere near the scale of use. It's not even close.
I'm surprised they're not using one of the ones that does the footnotes for them, so they can also put that together. But no, I mean, it makes sense to me. It's I don't know how this, how they find the equilibrium, but the issue will never be how do we attract more people.
Yeah, well, it seems like for OpenAI at least. I think that is for everybody else. I think that is the case. Like, how do we get more people? But for OpenAI right now, it's just clever. I mean, it's like the Y Combinator playbook. Let's do something viral. And they got one viral thing they know to lean in on it. And because GPTs, like they just threw them out there, they didn't know if these would be super popular or not. Like you could tell that if you watch the engineering presentation on this, the engineers, not the keynote, the keynote's fine too, but the engineers, like they're super geeked out about it. But who knows if people are going to use it, how much they're going to like it, if it'll be good or not, that type of thing. But they got immediate feedback.
I will say, I think if someone said, pick just one type of GPTs that will be the most popular, at least for a while, whoever comes up with the best prompt engineering for the average person one, if whoever has one where it's like you say, this is the kind of thing I want to do, give me a prompt that will make this happen on ChatGPT, and they get a good prompt, that's going to be really popular.
Maybe. I mean, those existed as Chrome plugins for a while, and they also became GPT plugins, and then and there are several GPTs now that do that.
I'm saying even narrower than that. Like if you're a grad student, you say, "Help me come up with a prompt that will put together a great 4-page paper on this subject," and then there you go.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think you're right. Although, we've talked a lot about the companion and the entertainment aspect here. There are no fewer than 4 AI boyfriends listed as GPTs right now. There are a couple of AI girlfriends. But the other thing is, like, what we were able to discern is there are about 4,000 public GPTs as of a couple of days ago. And this is changing daily, so there's probably many more. But I suspect the number of private GPTs is probably triple or quadruple that. And so, like with character AI, which you don't necessarily share your GPT, that's your AI girlfriend or boyfriend. I wonder if a lot of people will just do that within ChatGPT as well.
Depends if they prefer the famous names that are coming out with their fake or the AI girlfriends and boyfriends.
That's true. It's true. And actually, guardrails are an important thing. So Nisha Williams has a comment here, and thanks, Nisha, for asking this or a question. When it comes to Gen AI, what safety measures are in place to help protect vulnerable teens online? And that's a really good point. So one of the things that also some of the Gen Z people that I talked to, younger Gen Z people, said, hey, we're not using ChatGPT as much anymore because basically it's the guardrails. They don't use that terminology, but they're like, the guardrails, the safety mechanisms are too strict. And so it was more fun 6 or 8 months ago before they started locking everything down. And I think this might be also an advantage that someone like Character AI might have, as well, as that they leave it more open to some of the topics that are important to people creating AI boyfriends and girlfriends.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, on a technical level, I don't know how feasible or difficult it would be to do, but until they can come up with a Google like safe search system equivalent, then it's going to be they're going to err on the side of being more limited.
Yeah, I think that's just where they are. And so, Nisha, I mean, the answer really is that it's on a case-by-case basis. The organizations who create the language models themselves can put guardrails on in terms of how they're used, even at the API level. And then when you put an application on, you can layer on additional guardrails that handles topics in a certain way or don't. And then the reinforcement learning with human feedback process, and then also the user feedback with like the thumbs down if they don't like a thing, or the other types of complaints, or even online social media posts, then lead people to go back, look at that, enhance the guardrails, or put in specific information during a retraining process when they bring out a new model in order to make it less likely that some of those things happen. But there is no standard. Everyone's doing it their own way.
Yeah, there's a GPT idea for you, a GPT that helps you get around guardrails.
Oh, it's actually not that hard. So for example, like I created this GPT just as like a demonstration product. It's called Superhero Me. And what it does is you basically go and you can upload a selfie and it turns you into a superhero, and then it'll give you a backstory and you can do trivia and like you can have an arch villain, all these other things that are sort of fun to do, like if you're doing it. And I did another one, like I was like, well, let's just see if I can do this, like Jedi me, like turn you into a Jedi or turn you into a character from South Park. And the Superhero Me, for some reason, I think it's because I didn't put it as like a little checkbox. You can upload an image of yourself and it'll turn you like some sort of reasonable semblance of yourself into a superhero. But for the Jedi one and not the Simpsons, but the South Park one, it will basically say it's against our policy to do images of real people. So it's the same system, but the guardrails are being used differently just because, and frankly, it's just like a very minor difference in the way we constructed both of those. So interesting. Nish had another one. Are children getting education around AI in schools? Some schools have banned it. A lot of schools banned it. I think, Eric, you had an article earlier this year about at least 5 school districts had banned it right away.
There was a lot of immediate cracking down. That's expanded. There's been more nuanced policy since then. And honestly, I think one of the bigger issues now is less, all the students are using it, and more, how do we train educators to deal with it, and to know the difference between, say, using Grammarly to like clean up your language to make it flow more smoothly versus using a ChatGPT to actually write it for you, because they can get confused. And as we've discussed, text tests are not very good, and sometimes you get that professor in Texas who failed his entire class, even though because he asked ChatGPT if ChatGPT was used to make their papers, and led to a whole big mess.
Yeah, very good questions. Okay, so another story we have this week, which nobody's like paying any attention to, and we'll see if they do in the future, but OpenGPT, LangChain, an open source solution, has created the alternative to OpenAI's GPTs. And, frankly, it works very similarly, except for it just doesn't have as many features. I think one of the things that are particularly interesting is you can choose any LLM that you want. So let's say you can actually, there's a playground that's like a demonstration playground, which actually runs on GPT 3.5 Turbo, which I thought was kind of funny. But the whole idea there is you can create GPTs in the open source environment, all these other types of things. And so you can have the same type of idea. I don't think this is going to take off, because I think once you actually have to bring in your own language model, things get harder, even if you have model as a service and those types of things. But also there's not that user base. Like, how do you share it with people? We saw this in the voice space. People were creating like open source voice assistants, and they created a framework for people to create skills or applications that run on voice, and they just didn't take off. And part of it was because the organization itself wasn't building a lot of features and applications, and then like no one else had an incentive to, because the way to share and build visibility was a bit truncated. I think this will change. They're going to build a marketplace for this, and maybe it'll become super popular. I don't see a lot of momentum around it. I would like to see more momentum around it, because I think it's a really great idea to create a scenario where people with no code or with light coding skills can actually create some really powerful customized copilots for their life. So, hey folks, this is Game, the Generative AI News Rundown. Give us a like if you are on LinkedIn or YouTube. And we're going to jump into the Product Garden segment that we have every week. We're going to go through a lot of these pretty quickly, actually. But I did want to hit on some things. I think Microsoft and OpenAI really gave us a nice framework to talk about what's going on with the industry broadly. But it never stops. There's stuff going on every day. So you had a story about U.com. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so U.com, they're search engine developer. They've been involved in generative AI for a while now. They were actually relatively early in coming up with a chatbot that could do search using a generative AI chatbot. But their new thing is a set of different APIs. So the idea being that if you are someone who builds your own generative AI chatbot directly, or perhaps using a GPT, maybe not GPT exactly, but something like that, you can now link it to the internet to get up-to-date information. You don't have to rely on the sort of static databases. And similarly, they have one designed specifically for news, and they're really aiming at there's a lot of search engines out there. There's a lot of specialized search engines out there, and generative AI has really thrown the industry up in the air a bit. And this is a way for them to combine what they already offer with some of the perks of using large language models.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I mean, I wrote a story about U.com last December, so almost a year ago. It was super popular in the newsletter because that was really my first deep dive into using generative AI for search. I had actually used generative AI through what they called InstructGPT in the OpenAI playground earlier, before ChatGPT came out. And then afterwards it was okay, like obviously people had access to it, but I found it was really useful for certain types of searches. And U.com I thought was great, except for just like the hallucinations were off the charts bad. And the links were not very good. And I've noticed that, like, once Perplexity came out, it's just much better grounded, much better on the hallucinations front. And then BingChat, obviously, also as well. And I haven't really seen many people talking about U.com lately. So I wonder if they have that much traction. I think it's good to have more options in the marketplace, but I don't know if you have an observation on that.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, it's a thing. It's like, sometimes we talk about like the Microsoft or Google, where it's it feels like they take up the whole market, but the market's really big. So anything that any even a small chunk can be a very successful business. And I think U.com sees an opening for something like what they offer improved versus trying to remake the entire search engine world from top to bottom the way that some of the bigger names are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and it just in the chat, if you're in LinkedIn, Nisha Williams has a question. Do you know any speakers in the industry that can present the dangers of AI parents should be aware of? That's not my area of expertise, but if anybody has an answer to that, please drop that into the comments for her. That would be awesome. All right, so Unity actually made a bunch of announcements yesterday, and it's all about Muse. And how it's the tool that we've talked about for a while, and you can use it in order to create images more quickly and all these other things that just make it easier. And I think it's really interesting there. And they've got Convey and Inworld are supported on there, Layer, which we've talked about in the past, Leonardo. But it's just this idea of like a Copilot for building your games. And they've made some really good progress on it. I think it's also very interesting that Unity is really designed, or the whole positioning has been for the developers that don't have all the resources of the big game studios that use Unreal Engine. Like Unity, you can be a one-person shop, you can be 5 people, you can still create a great game. And this idea that you're basically, helping them augment or level up their team, I think is really interesting. They made one other comment, and I know you haven't written about this yet, but you might be familiar with the news. One other thing they focused on is or curating the data set, particularly around images, so they're not using copyrighted material. And it's interesting. It's like they sort of used it, but they sort of didn't. It's like multiple steps removed. So mostly what you get out of that, your 20 wall textures or whatever it is, like the objects you need in the background in your game that don't seem to matter that much, but you want higher quality. They're basically saying should be all copyright-free material.
Yeah, and going back to talking about an app store, Unity has already created a marketplace for video game developers, a generative AI marketplace for video game developers. So if you have put together a piece of software or tool that uses generative AI and is supposed to help with developing or creating video game, you can put that on the Unity's marketplace. So they're already thinking bigger in terms of being a platform and not just a tool set. So I think this makes sense. And yeah, again, it's all about shortening the distance between I have an idea to I have a product, and Unity's thinking, all right, well, what about all those people making video games? That's always been their philosophy, and now it's even faster.
Absolutely. All right. Symphony AI, another story here. Pratik Kathpal is the CEO there. We've known him for a long time. He's been on the VoiceBot podcast. In fact, he's going to be a guest coming up on the VoiceBot podcast in the next couple of months as well. So generative AI, industrial copilots, industrial. So we've seen that twice today. Tell me about this news.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Talking about how looking beyond the home and the the cubicle office into the factory. Symphony AI, they've always been industrial focused, but now they're creating copilots that are supposed to help manufacturers. Like, if you're working in a factory, it's supposed to be, if you need help with a specific step, or if you see, a repair or a maintenance issue that you need to deal with, it can help answer those questions. So you don't have to, look through a giant book or try to, memorize that giant book. And really using the generative AI elements to be more proactive, to spot the small problems ahead of time, or when you describe what you're doing, and the LLM, the AI can actually come back and say, oh, don't forget this, rather than only talking about what the user says. They can look at the bigger context, and I think that's very useful for factories.
Well, I think too, they've got a workflow builder, things like that. A lot of people know that, like voice flow, a lot of these things have these visual builders, sort of creating these experiences with LLM backend. But I think, we usually think about knowledge work being sort of the biggest impact area of generative AI, but there's a lot of other areas as well, because even people you don't think of as being a knowledge work type business, they have to frequently consult knowledge bases in order to do their job. And I think this is super interesting.
Yeah, and the way they've it's not just one giant copilot. It's they have one that's specifically about improving a plant performance. There's another one that's specifically about scheduling and production schedules, and another one that's more about that is more focused on like looking through manuals and procedures and troubleshooting and really speeding up how that operates. It's a smart move on their part, I think.
And scheduling, by the way, particularly in manufacturing and logistics perspective, is extremely complex. And it's not even that the generative AI models need to handle the computation associated with that, because there have been tools around for a long time to do that. It's what's amazing, or what's really intriguing here, is that you can use natural language to get access to that information. So basically, this natural language front end, and Satya Nadella talked about this idea as Copilots being the new UI. So yes, large language models are amazing with text and language data in ways that we haven't been able to do previously through brute force methods. But for other areas where it's more computationally heavy, having that natural language interface makes a big difference. Makes it more accessible to everybody, and they'll get more value out of it.
Yeah, and even though they have plenty of their own technology involved in this, they are still, as every company has to be, it feels like they do work with Microsoft and Microsoft, Azure, OpenAI, and with what Microsoft just announced, now it sounds like you just show a picture of a bunch of boxes stacked in a factory and say, all right, how do I get this out of here in the most efficient way possible?
I know, pretty amazing. Or just count them for you.
Yeah,
those are always very popular. All right, so there was actually, this is perfect, because there's a question from Nisha about like which design apps best for business presentations, logo design, iconography. There are several that are using generative AI, but Picsart was one of the earliest adopters. I think it was like October of last year, so over a year now. They've had access to, I want to say it was Stable Diffusion, which was their first implementation, but they have recently updated this.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I was writing about them. Yeah, last November, about their image and text generators, and it was Stable Diffusion. It was relatively early, but even in some ways even faster than some of the maybe better known or bigger companies in the space. Picsart's been very into making generative AI an element in basically everything they offer. This new launch essentially combines everything they've already done plus a bunch of new tools and features into one branding, also called Ignite for some reason. But yeah, it's like 24 generative AI tools, including the ones that we've seen before, like replacing and editing objects, and new tools that can be used for videos, for making GIFs, for translating ideas that you have into specific styles that you can then apply across different social media posts and things. It's really
the obvious question is, how does it compare to Canva?
It's very similar. From looking from a distance, they look very similar because they were both very similar. They're both about visual art studios, visual studios for digital ideas, basically. But I'd say it's a little bit in the UI, it's a little bit in the tech, but it's honestly about what do you prefer using. I know people who prefer Picsart, and I know people who prefer Canva, regardless of generative AI. They just find that the way it works is for them, feels more comfortable. So I think it's going to be about pushing on the. I think the features, broad strokes, are going to be very similar. It's just going to be about little details and little aspects of who it's for, who it's aimed at. Canva has always been both for business and made a point of being a bit, artsy. Like they do art challenges every day, for instance. Whereas Picsart is, I think, a little more on the, you don't want to use Adobe, but you work in a business that needs a lot of visual stuff, then use Picsart.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, you had this other story here. Let's go back to LLM land. Google deepens Anthropic partnership as generative AI tug of war with AWS intensifies. And I think we did talk about this briefly last week, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that back and forth where everyone's trying to be this alternative to OpenAI.
Yeah, well, because what had happened was that there had been reports that were unofficial, but were essentially confirmed that Google had plans to invest up to $2 billion in Anthropic. And what this official news was that Anthropic will be turning to Google Cloud for using their TPUs, using their chips, and that they're going to be very closely integrated, despite the fact that, as we talked about last time, there's this real tug of war between Google and Amazon, or between AWS and Google Cloud, about Anthropic, because they want an alternative to OpenAI, because Microsoft has OpenAI basically locked up in all the big ways. So it's just it feels like two suitors trying to woo someone and giving more and more expensive and fancy gifts. And in this case, Google Cloud said, hey, we have this brand new, incredibly powerful TPU set up. Come use them. And Anthropic said, yes, we will, despite having previously talked about working with AWS.
The ML Commons data and another benchmark I just saw shows that the Google TPUs are well behind.
It's really impressive. Yeah.
The NVIDIA GPTs are just much better.
Yeah, I would say it's impressive until you look at NVIDIA.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so final question before we do winners and losers of the week. If you guys have winners and losers of generative AI for this week, you can put it in the comments if you like. But we've got one funding fountain story this week. Layer Health raised $4 million.
Yeah, I think, as we've talked about at some points over the course of this year, the healthcare world might not seem the most immediate beneficiary of generative AI, but it has a lot of potential and there's already a lot of money going in there. In this case, specifically looking at how it can help medical professionals not spend so much time doing paperwork. It can help them better organize and sort through data to help diagnose and look for ways of treating patients. And this one seems to be it's just relatively small or relatively young company, but it has Google Ventures behind it, General Catalyst. I mean, it's some solid names there to make it possible for to really combine medical records and help the people who have to sort through all that paperwork not spend all their time doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Natalie Harris, formerly of Amazon, soon of another giant mango company, was doing their PR for this. And so If you get Natalie involved, it must be pretty good. Okay, winners and losers of the week. I'll start with the winner. I think that OpenAI is the winner because anytime you tell people you don't want their money because we have scalability problems, you create a big wait list and you already have a huge business behind it. I think it just reinforces the fact that you're doing something right with your business because people are clamoring to give you their money.
Yep.
Your winner.
I'm going to say video game developers, not only because of what we just talked about, but there's also news about Inworld working with Xbox to bring their technology there. So between Inworld and Character and some of the other projects going on, there's a lot of opportunity for people who don't know how to code or build a game, but who have a really good idea to really put their work out there.
Yeah, great. How about a loser this week?
Let's see. Anyone who wanted to talk about technology that wasn't Microsoft, because there's several things I was looking into that are genuinely interesting, but trying to just sort through the deluge from Microsoft after just getting out of the deluge from OpenAI was quite tricky.
And it's all Microsoft, right? Because they had GitHub Copilot, you had OpenAI, which they own probably 49% of, we think. And they had this. So that was a big thing. My loser this week is actually Google. I could have said any other large language model provider, but I think most of them are really, they don't really believe that they're going to be on par with OpenAI. I think most of them are like, they're moving towards some sort of specialization. Anthropic maybe is holding out those hopes. And I'm sure maybe they do. It sort of depends on the day, like if they're optimistic or not about that. But Google definitely does want to be that general purpose one. And I think the momentum that's going on around OpenAI, it's just going to be really hard for them to overcome. And someone was telling me about this big pharmaceutical company they're doing a project with. And they said the one requirement is we were not going to use OpenAI. And then when they were told that the alternative was to spend $20,000 a month to spin up their own large language model, custom open source large language model, they said, okay, so let's sign up for OpenAI. And I think like that's what I'm finding more and more is that like the corporations either want OpenAI because it's what they see out there and they trust, particularly because the Microsoft support really gives them confidence, or because because it's like the path of least resistance, even if they would like to do something else. And so I think Google's going to announce Gemini, I think on the 13th of December. That's going to be kind of amazing, but they're going to be running headlong into an enthusiasm gap. And I'm not really sure how they overcome that.
Yeah, I do think what's telling is that sometimes it feels like OpenAI created a market out of nowhere, and now they're really shaping that market. They're saying, if you want to play in the space, you'll have to follow these rules. We built the playground. Here's how you're allowed to play on the swings.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's leave it with that. Hey, everyone, give us a like on LinkedIn or YouTube if you're still out there. Thanks a lot for being here. We try to be here every Thursday, but we will not be here next week. Big holiday week in the U.S. We're going to take a week off. We haven't really done that much here, but we'll be back in 2 weeks with Gain. And check out the YouTube channel. Check out those GPTs on parade. I think you'll really like that. All right, everyone. I'm Brett Kinsella. This is Gain, the Generative AI News Rundown by SymphonyAI and VoiceBot.ai. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks.